Hello everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today I'll be showing you the best weapons to use at level 3 traders. This tier of progression is interesting because there are several reasons why unlocking these vendors is important outside of the weapons themselves, because outside of certain endgame guns, you can get a hold of most of them through the flea market even before this. Instead, what makes the difference here is things like ammunition, magazines, and cheap weapon mods that make new options viable that weren't previously, even if we could buy the base guns. So we're going to go through these in order of access, and Jaeger is our first one at level 22. Surprisingly. Now, most standard account players don't get access to him at level 22 because of trader rep, but if you're on EOD, often you'll find that Jaeger opens up first before the others because you have that extra 0.2 that just tips you over the edge. In terms of weapons that he has to offer, there's not actually a great deal. Mainly it's the SV98 OV, which is much better than the default variant because it has over 20 ergonomics more than the standard one, and it's lighter as well. So if you want to do some bolt action shooting with 7.62x54R, this is actually a pretty good option. He also sells the Saiga 12 meme cannon and Nerf gun. This is really just a way of getting the flare sight. If you can buy the components cheaply, you can get a flare relatively cost effectively like this, and towards the end of the wipe, I mean even now, you sometimes find this thing sold out because it's a way of getting this thermal quite easily. Not really a weapon, but he also sells the Red Rebel Ice Pick, which is really important if you want to play reserve a bunch. It's also useful on Lighthouse as well, but not as useful as on reserve to avoid D2. And you've got the barter here for relatively common components that you can buy. I think it's just under 2 million at the moment, so if you want to pick that up, then you can get that from Jaeger 3, which is pretty cool. Now, one other thing that he sells, if you look into ammunition, there's a few different cartridges that he sells, but the most important one here is Flechette. You have to do the forest clearing quest, which comes after the factory office kills quest, so you don't get access to this straight away. But once you have Flechette, this turns shotguns into a complete beast and allows you to shoot at center of mass. I've done lots of videos about the 153 and the 155 with Flechette in the past. Over longer ranges, it does start to suffer a little bit, so you do have to be careful, and especially with the black limb changes and the way that spillover doesn't give as much damage over to the rest of the body anymore from the arms and the stomach and the legs. This actually really hurt Flechette because it's one of the lower damage shotgun shells with 200 damage total, and if you're firing at people from a decent distance, the hitting it to the arms, the misses, and armor absorbing a couple of Flechette darts, that all has made Flechette actually a little bit weaker, but on factory and at really short ranges, this still works just as good as it always used to. So next, let's jump over to Peacekeeper. And Peacekeeper you can access at level 23, which is kind of interesting, and he does actually have a good amount of weapons and things on him that are useful for us. We have some weapons like the MP7, although this is probably better to buy on the flea market. If you see here, they are a lot cheaper there, but it is one option that you could buy from him if they do get expensive. And he also has a couple of other guns too, like the P90 in cash, although again, I would argue that using the barter version is usually superior. This one is at Peacekeeper 2. It's a slightly better variant too, longer barrel and the top rail, and it only costs 2 military cables, and so that ends up being about 60k, so that's usually a bit of a better option than buying it from him directly. You can get access to the Orge 3 on him too, but again, you can buy this on the flea, so it's really not that big of a deal. But the one gun that is kind of special on Peacekeeper is the RSAS barter, which you just can't do at the moment. It just seems to be such low stock. But the SR25, this is a really, really good weapon, and a lot of people like the SR25. It's a good combination between extremely decent return to center time, you can get good ergonomics out of it, you can get good recoil. Like, it's not as cumbersome as the M1A, it's not as heavy as the RSAS. The SR25 is kind of like an amazing middle ground of all of these weapons. You can mod it relatively straightforwardly, to be honest, even in this standard configuration. What I would advise doing, it starts off with 117 vertical recoil. So if we just use our standard, the ATP, because we're not yet at level 4 traders, so we can't use the ARE yet. We use the ATP from Skier, which gives you 2.5 recoil reduction. We can't get the butt pad yet because we haven't necessarily completed all of Gunsmith. If you have, you could do the MOE SG plus the MOE rubber butt pad. If you haven't, then you just go for the DS150, which, as you can see, the stats are very similar. Put on some kind of very average grip. I'm just going to use an OMRG Black for this example. You can then buy these AFG M-Locks from Peacekeeper, which is really nice. We'll stick that on. And then you could just pull any suppressor or combination through, really. There's lots of different ones that you could choose from. Let's just go with the Thunder Beast just for now, because there's a nice barter that you can get on Skier for this, which is the Tequila cap and the leather caps. So this is usually kind of my go-to. And this gets you to something like 73 vertical recoil, which is fine. If you have some of this saved up, or maybe you're starting to craft ammos in the workbench, then that could be a good option. I know a lot of people like the SR25. I haven't really used it that much this wipe, but it can be a decent option. Some other interesting things that are on Peacekeeper that enable us to actually use other guns is the ammo. So in terms of ammunition, he gives us actually quite a few different important pieces. The first one being M855A1, which is really the staple cartridge for 5.56, as you can buy it from him directly. This thing deals with class 4 very easily, and it is reasonable against class 5. It's not a first hit pen straight through kind of thing against a Karund or anything like that, but after 2 or 3 shots, you should be penetrating and getting kills using 5A1, which is good. The quest that you need to complete for this is the Cult Part 1. which was the old quest that you had to do for 56A1, but that was brought back to Peacekeeper too. So stacking 55A1 and 56A1 can be quite a nice way of ensuring that you don't run out of these bullets, because you can only buy 90 at a time. It's not that many, especially if you want to run these guns all day. The next bullet is FMJ-SX. This really opens out the MP7. We talked about it before, and this is one of the reasons why the MP7 is so cheap on the flea market, because until you get access to this, and also to some magazines that we'll talk about a little bit later on mechanic, it's very difficult to use this weapon. You used to be able to buy subsonic ammo for the MP7, and that had nearly the same pen, but now that that got nerfed and they introduced this new cartridge, JSP, that's nowhere near as good, it's just not as compelling to use anymore as an SMG until you get to this particular point. So this ammo is really good. You can see it's out of stock because a lot of people use it. In my opinion, it is the best SMG in the game simply because of the ammunition and how it deals with class 4 armor so easily. He also sells AP 6.3, and this is an extremely disappointing round, but it does add a little bit of extra punch to your 9mm weapons to allow them to get through class 3 helmets. And he also sells L191 as well, which for the P90, now that SS190 is craft only, as it was last wipe, but SB193, the subsonic round, has also been nerfed, very similarly to the MP7 one. L191 is now the second best ammunition in this caliber, which it's not as good as the old SB193 was, but it is usable, and if you're using, say, the barter for the 2 military cables, you can get a P90 really cheaply. The advantage of the P90 is you can just spray at people's faces, it has very low recoil, and it has a very big magazine. That's a big USP for the P90, is the 50 rounders by default, they take an eternity to pack, but if you're just spraying L191, kind of got to make sure that you try to hit the face, because if you hit somebody with class 5, you're gonna have to hit them a lot before it goes through, which is why I'm not a huge fan of it. And I'd rather have the MP7 because it will eventually deal with it, but you can use this for using the P90 finally, because before this the rounds are really just not very good. One other thing that Peacekeeper sells is a couple of different magazines that open out some other options, the main one being this, the Surefire 60, so you can add 60 round magazines to your 5.56 weapons, which is pretty powerful. To mention here, you can only get the 20 round MP7 mags, so I have used this in the past. Some people say it's impossible to use because of the fire rate. If you take like 6 magazines with you, it is all right. You do have to reload a lot, obviously. It's better to have 30s, but those come a little bit later in the progression, but it is possible to use 20 rounders. I have done it. It's not the best, but it's also not the worst. So next, let's move on to Prapor, and Prapor opens up at level 26 technically, and he has the new weapon, the AVT-40, which we're going to talk about first. It costs 1 teapot, which at the moment costs, well, down to 33,000 rubles, which is absolutely outrageous for this particular weapon. It's kind of situational. You have to be close up. You don't want to be fighting long range with this gun, but if you can position well and be in the right place with its 750 RPM, this is basically the fastest time to kill in the game outside of something like, one-shotting people with Lapua Magnum AP. It's pretty crazy. It's probably going to get more expensive or be nerfed or pushed up the trader brackets a little bit or something. I've used this on factory, which is obviously the perfect place for it, and 15 rounds of 7.62x54 is enough to pretty much kill anybody. To be honest, even Tagilla, who I managed to take down with this gun, with his class 6 rig. Now, Prapor does have a bunch of other AKs. We can see the AKM-N, the MSN, the 74M, the 103, the 104, the 105. So there's quite a few different weapons that he has here. The AKMs do get quite good later because they can have the 308 adapter, but at this point in time, we are not actually able to buy that. So sometimes the 103 for this mid-tier might actually be a better option, because this starts with 88 recoil, whereas the AKM-N starts with 96. And given that we can't access all of the meta muscles anyway, you're probably better off starting with the one with slightly improved statistics if you're going to be then using all of the same components. So the 103 is maybe a contender, especially with this new PP bullet that we'll talk about in one moment. He also sells the AK-12, which you can get access to. I need to do some more work on this gun yet. I haven't actually used it myself because I've been busy doing other things, but I'm going to put something together about this soon. Starts with 55 vertical recoil, which isn't half bad. If you look at the 74M, this starts with 68, so it's not too bad. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the RPK. The RPK is kind of similar, with a 60 starting versus this 55. So I think it's like an okay option. And the fire rate of 700 is slightly faster than the regular AK fire rate of 650, so the time to kill is a little increased. I'm not a massive fan of 545, partly because of its inability to one-shot people with class 4 helmets on, which I find really annoying, but it can be okay. The VSS barter, I don't think this is really worth it unless something crazy is going on, like at the end of last wipe where everyone had to use one, because they are normally pretty cheap on the flea market, but they are usable at Prapor 3, but we'll talk about that in a second as to the reason. And he also has the SR2M, which is another weapon that I think has become quite good, simply because the P90 and the MP7 prior to FMJ have kind of gone down because the subsonic rounds have been nerfed. The bullets for this are decent and are also accessible on Prapor himself, so we'll move over to have a look at those now. He sells a bunch of good ammo at this trade level, so PS is really not that bad, it's alright. The one above this, BT, you do have to craft, but PS is honestly decent for an SMG PDW style of gun. Other ammunition that opens up other types of weapons is SPP. So we just talked about the VSS, and the reason why I think the VSS opens up now is because yes, you can buy SPP from Prapor, and SPP is pretty good, especially if you're not fighting people with class 5 all the time. You'd probably rather have SP6, but you can't unlock that until a little bit later. So SPP kind of opens out the VSS, and they are really cheap. The magazines are expensive if you don't buy the 20s. If you want to buy a 30 rounder, it's very, very expensive, normally about 40,000 rubles. So that's kind of the big kicker for the VSS, but it is actually pretty decent. It's a good weapon, and it's got high performing rounds to go with it, which is usually one of the reasons why we end up picking up a particular gun. Otherwise, we've got the new round 7.62x39 PP. This is where I think the 103 might become a little bit more usable early on, because trying to bridge that gap between PS and BP, by the time you've got enough BP, normally you've got the 308 adapters, or you've got the RD704 or the Mutant. You don't need to use either the AKM series or the AK103 style weapon. You just don't need to. Whereas now in the mid game, we can use this PP round instead to kind of bridge the gap, and maybe use a tier 3 trader modded AK103 to great effect. This will deal easily with class 4, which is kind of what you want, because PS will do it, but it takes a couple of shots, and the higher recoil of the AKs, you want to have that mitigated by the ammunition. You don't want to be firing somebody 3 or 4 times with an AK when you could just shoot them with 5.56 and kill them in 3 hits, and with less recoil to boot. Another ammo that he stocks here is PS. I don't think this is a huge game changer. This moves you basically from the T46M and LPS up to PS, which it does more damage against class 5 armors in terms of armor damage, so in the second and third shots you should kill them. You can have the bullets absorbed if somebody's wearing a decent class 5 using T46 and LPS, which is one reason why you want to maybe move up to PS. But PS is out of stock at the moment, and it's a lot more expensive than the other two, so it's not necessarily a game changer. You still can get away with T46 in your SVDs and in your Mosins if you want to use those, and SVTs. Let's not forget the SVT. So next up at level 28 is Skier. Skier doesn't offer that much stuff at tier 3 traders, similar to Jaeger, but there are a few interesting guns that I'd like to point out. The RFB, I don't think it's worth buying because there's a barter which is cheaper down at tier 2 traders, but the MCX is actually kind of interesting these days. Now, why is this good? It is expensive as a weapon. It is expensive to mod. It doesn't get quite as low as the M4 and all of those kind of guns, but there is a new ammunition on Skier 3 here, which is Blackout CBJ, and this is the intermediary bullet. This is a bit like 7.62 PP, but for 300 Blackout, and this sits between M62, which is sold by Peacekeeper, and 300 AP, which seems to have been removed from the game entirely. You don't seem to even be able to craft this anymore, which is kind of crazy. But this is effectively as good as, if not better than, 5.5A1. It's kind of like an intermediary between 5.5A1 and the PP bullet. It's extremely powerful. It's actually better than PP in both regards. And coming out of the MCX, you've got an 800 RPM fire rate. The MCX is not necessarily the easiest weapon to control. If you use it almost like an expensive glorified SMG, this will actually rip people to shreds, even players wearing class 5 armor, and it will outperform most other weapons, including things like the MP7 and the P90 if you're fighting armored targets in CQB. I quite like the MCX for that. I have used it a little bit. It didn't feel too bad, honestly, and this new CBJ round really does bring up the feasibility of using the MCX because the 300 Blackout AP round is now just so rare. This is basically it on Skier. He doesn't really sell anything else. You can get a DVL from him with a barter, a Vector with 45, which I don't think is really that meta, and a couple of different magazines for Glocks and stuff like that. So let's move straight over onto Mechanic, which is Mechanic 3 at level 30, which is really when a lot of the stuff opens out with the game. There's a couple of things in here that are really cool. The M4A1 LVOA barter is one of the best. His SOP mod barter at tier 2 traders is very, very good for a staple M4, but the beauty of the LVOA is that it comes with a Raptor charging handle, which is the best with +3 ergonomics. It also comes with the MUR upper, which is the most recoil reducing upper that you can get to, which really helps with making M4s get down from kind of the 50s recoil into the sort of 40s and maybe high 30s. It really does help with that. And it also comes with a semi-decent grip and a relatively good handguard as well. So it's pretty usable. And for this, you can buy it for 100k. The reason I often end up using the M4 LVOA is because I end up with GP coins that I die with, and then they're in my docs case or something. And then I've got these non-finding rate GP coins that I have to use for something. And I think this is probably the best barter that you can do with GP coins and actually use it for something sensible. Likewise, the AK-74M Zenitco, if you do want to pick up a weapon like this is honestly not a bad starting point. It only costs 6 Marlboros and an M cable, and these are really cheap at the moment because they're not really used for that much other stuff. And there's things here that you can't get access to otherwise, not at this level anyway. Things like the RK3, so this is a quest locked one for 10k. Normally on the flea these would be 40,000 rubles, but that's part of this weapon, which is pretty nice. It comes with the really nice stock as well. It's got a decent handguard on it, and it's got a bastion rail and an okay muzzle brake on it. All of this stuff is not too bad, so that's maybe a potential pickup. The next one that is a complete game changer is the AK-101. Yes, you can buy the AK-101 on the flea market, but until you get up to level 3 traders, not necessarily mechanic, it's nice to be able to buy the gun from him directly, but until you can get to level 3 mechanic, it's just not really worth running this weapon in my opinion. The one big game changer and the build that I always like, and I talk about it every wipe, is this VDM CS gas tube. This is the Kibber Arms CS gas tube that comes from Mechanic 3 only. It's very, very rare to find in raids, so they're never ever on the flea market. If you see, there's just no listings at all. And this allows you to use the UFM Krebs, which is cheap on the fleet because nobody knows what it's for, at least not until I talk about it every single wipe. And then you could do whatever else that you want with it. If you can access the RRD, which is this version is the AK-74 one, which is Mechanic 3, you can stick that on and then put on really any vertical foregrip. We'll just use an RVG black just for the purposes of this particular video, and then stick a butt pad on the end, which is a gunsmith part. It's before the RSAS one though, so you should be able to get access to it before then. Swap this over to a Bastion rail. So you have this on the top, and then you just, pick your lasers, pick your sights. But you've got a 66 ergonomics gun with 41 vertical recoil that fires 5.56. The big downside of the AK-101 is you can only run 30s, but if you're only going to run 30 round magazines anyway, this is honestly one of my favorite guns. It's still one of my favorite guns in the game. I still love it now. And with 5.56 being brought back to Peacekeeper 3, so you can use 5.5A1 at Peacekeeper 3 and 5.6A1 at Peacekeeper 2. I think once you get to level 3 traders to actually be able to put this build together, even if we just use like MOE AK or something, we've just got such crazy ergo. The ADS speed on this guy is insane. This build I normally just use it with a holographic, say, something like the EOTech, and just run it like that with a laser on the side. And it just absolutely is carnage in CQB. I used this for a whole month on labs and held my own in there, which was decent. It's good. Very good. So I really rate the 101, but only at level 3 traders. I don't do a level 2 traders build for it because I just don't think it justifies it. And I think you're better off with something like the MDR or the G36 or something else that doesn't need as much work on it as the AK-101, because the 101 starts at 62 vertical recoil. It's okay, but you can make it better than this. Outside of that, what else have we got that's interesting? We have the M1A SAS. This is good because not that many people are doing this yet. Wilsons tend to be pretty cheap. If you get 6 of these, if these cost 6k and you need 18 of them, I'm going to do a little bit of quick mathematics. This is a 6 times 18. It gets you to 108,000 rubles. This is the meta build for the M1A. You technically don't need to do anything with this really, except put on a vertical foregrip and a muzzle brake. And that's all you have to do. If we change over, let's use the Thunder Beast again, just so that we can benchmark ourselves the way that we did with the SR previously. Muzzle brakes and things, because the M1A has a really high base recoil, it actually benefits a lot from these kinds of mods. Yes, you can add a butt pad onto this. If you don't have that, obviously, as before, we can change this over to the ATP plus the Chris stock. If you just don't have access to the butt pad for the MOEs yet, we'll add the Chris Defiance on here. And then, yeah, you can just stick on any of these, OMRG, grip, or whatever. You've got 37 ergonomics and 57 vertical recoil. 57 vertical recoil is a lot better than on our SR25, and it is probably cheaper actually because of the way that the barter functions, which is pretty nuts. It is really heavy though. That's the only thing you have to bear in mind. And the return to center time is not as good as on the SR25, but those two things balance out, I think, because the gun has just such low recoil as base. He also sells a very, very important magazine. There's a few things here that are interesting, like the Chris 45 ACP mag if you want to run the Vector, for example, but the one that I think is critical is this one, the MP7 30 rounder. This opens up the MP7 and makes it actually usable. I don't really think it's worth using the MP7 until you get to Mechanic 3, because you need to be able to buy the gun, use FMJ from Peacekeeper, and use the 30 rounders. As I said, you can use the 20s, but the 30s is really where it opens out. The 40s are better, obviously, but the 30s are totally serviceable. You could bring 4 magazines with you, 1 in the gun, and that should suit you fine. You can reload into them relatively quickly as well, so bring some stacks of ammo, but the 30s just open up the MP7 so much. It's incredible. The final thing that I want to talk about is 366 AP. This is the bullet that you get on Mechanic 3, and this opens out without any quests at the moment, and this goes in both the VPO 215 and the VPO 209. This is an insane round. I've already showcased this in a previous video, but this will one-tap players wearing class 3 on their thorax, which is pretty nuts. I think it's great to use with the bolty. You can use it with the semi-auto, but I prefer to use other weapons for that. But I tend to use it if I'm doing Tarkov shooter or something like that I just need to get kills on scavs or players or whatever. Not necessarily headshots, because there is some accuracy downside to this. So over about 150 meters, it starts to get a little funny. But if you're fighting players within 100 meters, this is absolutely fine. It's like a cracked version of M80 that will actually one-shot people. So it's very, very good. I highly rate this bullet. It's extremely decent. You can buy it on the fleet, so you can technically get it earlier, but obviously getting it at a quarter of the price is significant and very good. You could try it in the 209 as a kind of semi-DMR, like close range, high-powered sort of thing that might one-shot. It's a bit of a strange hybrid. I don't really think it really fits. The problem with the 209 is that the starting recoil on it is so much higher than that of the AKs. We can actually just go and look. So the 209 begins with 165 vertical recoil, whereas like the Vepr, which is very similar to the AKMs, this starts with 98. Like it's nearly double the recoil. You can deck this thing out and you basically get to the starting recoil of a default Vepr KM 136, which is very, very strange, and you just can't really deal with it that much. But it's kind of to balance this ammo out, right? Now the APM would be absolutely cracked. If you could get the 209 down to something like 60 vertical recoil, it would be absolutely ridiculous. So that's the reason why you probably can't do this, because I think it would probably break the balance of the game. But yeah, APM, highly rate it. It's extremely good bullet. So hopefully that gives you a few ideas of what to use in your raids once you get to the different levels of tier 3 traders, right from level 22 all the way up to level 30. So as always, a big shout out to all my patrons, and have fun in your raids.